or post to the chat during this has consented to that use. Please note the SCA harassment and bullying policy currently on the screen. The SCA prohibits harassment and bullying of all individuals and groups. Participants engaging in this behavior are subject to appropriate sanctions. If you are subjected to harassment, bullying, or retaliation, or if you become aware of anyone being harassed or bullied, please contact a Seneschal, president of the SCA, or your Kingdom's Board Ombudsman. And I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, I still can't seem to get my computer to allow me to share. I can't figure out what setting it actually is going to be. I can share with Zoom. So I am going to fiddle around with this while I speak a little bit and try to see if I can get this to work. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to present with just me and no slides. Okay, so today's class is on pleating and smocking. It's something that I do a lot of. Take a step back, actually. My name is Cathain Reiter. I'm a member of the East Kingdom, Carolingia specifically. I've been sewing for quite a while. I'm members of Athena's Thimble Guild, which is an embroidery guild in our kingdom. And I am an Order of the Manche, which is our grant level award. I do a lot of English and German primarily from the 13th to 16th centuries. I know how to physically present my screen. I just have the permissions wrong. This is my work laptop, so thank you for your suggestion in the chat box, but that does not work. So I have made a lot of different things with smocking, and I do have some examples here to show you. So first off is the very first thing that I made. It's one of the really common things that you find in the SCA. It's a basic apron. You take a large amount of fabric, you can pleat it down. This has been washed and used and isn't in the best condition at the moment, but it's primarily honeycomb smocking over a lot of pleats. If you don't want something quite so fancy with all of the pleating, another style of apron without the smocking on top would be an apron that is for a German midwife. It's front and back. Once again, a lot of fabric pleated down into a much smaller area. As you can see, the pleats are not particularly big. Another example of pleating, you can take large amounts of fabric, once again, into a neckline for a chemise. Same thing with the sleeves. So it's definitely useful for getting things to fit. Another example of pleating would be a Langberg bra with a skirt on it. So the skirt is pleated into the waistband. And then you can get into things that are a little bit fancier. So this is a smocked shirt that has kind of an outline stitch done over in the embroidery. This is 120 inches of fabric smocked down into only 14 inches. So obviously huge amounts of fabric. And just, as you know, it becomes kind of thick around the neckline. After I did this shirt, I wanted to do another version of it and actually moved on to the shirt that I'm wearing. So this one has kind of pattern darning all inside the shirt. It is 240 inches smocked down to just 14 inches. So a lot of work there. There are other forms of pleating. For example, there are rolled pleats at my waist where all of them are literally rolled and tucked in to gather large amounts of fabric in a slightly different way. But that's not pleating that we're going to cover in this class. We're going to talk about the denser, smaller pleats that you see. And like I mentioned earlier, I primarily do 13th to 16th century European things. So a lot of the way that I do things and all of the examples that I've shown so far have been from those time periods. But I do also want to point out that pleating doesn't have to be some big elaborate project. It doesn't have to have yards and yards of fabric pleated down into a small amount. You can do something tiny, like a St. Birgit cap. You have gathering at the back to help hold your hair, so just a few little pleats in the back, and it helps to secure it and help turn the edges under to actually hold your hair in better. So it doesn't have to be some big project. It can be something that takes a lot less time. I find that it has a lot of uses, and you can actually see lots of examples of it in art and in historical clothing in general. So since I can't seem to get my slideshow to work, I do have a handout, which I am going to link in the comments.
Did you want to try emailing it to me or anything, and I can do it off of my computer, or would that be more complicated than it's worth?
I can possibly do that. Do you have your email address available that you can send me in? Or actually, hold on. Can I just change this? Do you have Facebook open?
Yes.
All right, I'm going to send you a link, and then I will get this sorted out sometime soon.
No worries.
Okay, hopefully that should work.
Came through, I just requested access.
I thought I gave you access. Hold on.
I have to run two Google accounts, one for Kingdom that lets me get into all the Google Meet, and I have my private one, and they're never running at the correct time.
Okay. My computer is being incredibly slow, I'm sorry. I am setting it up right now.
We've actually had a bunch of issues in the last week or so. Google changed the way it does some sign-ins, and it all gets worked out, but it's caused quite a few issues like this.
So it's not just me. Okay, so while I'm doing this, I'm just gonna continue talking. I was doing a whole bunch of show and tell, so obviously there's a lot that you can do with it, and I really have the same thing for white linen, it seems. But as I was getting to right before, I also have, come on, a handout. So
I am now in, so I can
okay.
switch.
I did just link the handout in the chat, so if people want to follow along on that instead, that will work as well. Okay, so apparently that's giving an access error too.
I refreshed mine and it suddenly let me in even though nothing had been changed. We've been having issues with Google sign-ins a lot this week.
Okay, well, to get started, I'm just going to talk. So examples of pleating that you find in artwork would be like this image, which is one of my favorite images by Hans Holbein. It's a heavily pleated shirt, much like what I'm wearing. You can find extant examples, like in the Museum of London, of a heavily pleated and smocked shirt. Not shirt, well, shirt because it's a sleeve. So how do you actually do pleating? That's kind of the question. The way I learned how to do pleating was to first mark your fabric, and after you mark it, you use a guide thread to help you gather your material. So this particular aspect of it, you can do in a few ways. You have things such as a ruler. You can mark out what you want in every, usually ½ inch is what I do, or a little smaller if you want. I wouldn't go too much bigger. Extant examples, about a ½ inch is pretty common. 1.4 centimeters down and in, so 0.7 centimeters is a pretty common one, pleat size that they found in the Langberg finds for their fragments and things of that nature. Another way that you can do the markings to help you do the pleating is to make a grid. For this particular one, it's just a manila file folder that I marked out all of the lines every ½ inch and poked a hole with an awl through each and every little intersection. So this is a ½ inch grid. If I want an inch grid, I can obviously skip every other hole. And I've used it quite a few times already, so it lasts for a while. Another one of my favorite ways to do the marking on fabric to get that dot grid that we're looking for, something that looks like that is what we're making to try and make it easier for it to pleat. There's this handy tape that you can buy. I got this online on Amazon. You can find it at Joann's too. It's just masking tape that has pre-marked increments on it. I have definitely been really lazy on times, and I got tired of marking everything off, so just put a bunch of that down and was able to very easily tell what the distance between my stitches was. I wouldn't recommend using this particular tape if you're going to be doing large amounts of pleating over a very wide area, because you're going to go through it rather quickly. However, for something small like a sleeve, like this is all honeycomb smocking on here, you can't really see the honeycomb very well because it's too dense. But for doing the sleeves, I got very frustrated with how thin this fabric is, and I did end up using a lot of that. More historic ways that you could do it would be to use, it's kind of a fancy awl that has a bunch of them evenly spaced out and prick through the fabric and make the mark by pricking. You can also do a prick and pounce method, which is something of having paper or a base of that nature where you would then put loose or powdered chalk or something of that nature over the top, and it will be able to go through the holes and mark your fabric. You can also, once you have practice and once you've done it a bunch of times, get away with not marking things. I think I may have proven that I've done a lot of pleating in my days. So quite often when I make my guide stitches, I will do by eye a ½ inch. And oftentimes I'll actually do a little trick for embroidery and write literally on my thumb the distance that I want so that I have the pen marks there. So when I'm picking up my stitches, I can just line it up with my thumb and have an easy mark to go. So one really important thing to remember when you're marking your fabric to help create your guides for doing your pleating stitch is to make sure that that mark is not going to be visible after you're done using your guide stitch. So you want it to be something that's going to wash out or something that will evaporate with the air, like one of those markers that are water or air erasable, or something that is just not going to be seen. I used an air erasable marker for a lot of these things that I marked, and like I said, I did a lot of it by eye without marking, so I didn't have to worry about it then. But don't use Sharpies or anything like that on your fabric that you want to keep and continue using, because you don't want the color to be visible through your embroidery, or if you're just leaving it as pleating, have it invisible there. Also be careful with pencils. Some pencils don't erase as well as you want, especially if you're using white fabric, which a lot of this can be. So once you actually have it marked, your next step is going to be to actually do a long running stitch to help gather it, or to do kind of a different little pickup stitch, which I will show both of those. So you can have your gather be either a even or balanced pleat, or an uneven or unbalanced pleat. So for an even pleat, at each mark, you go up or down for each dot. So if you can see, at all of these vertical alignments, I'm going up here, down here, up here, down here. It's important that each line looks the same. You don't want to be going up this hole and down this hole. Everything in the vertical aspect needs to actually match up. When you pleat something like this with a balanced gathering stitch, you're going to have the same amount of fabric in front as you will in back from the stitch. It tends to be a lot better for fabrics that have a looser weave, and it does itself gather easier. It's easier to put everything together and have things fold nicely. However, when you use this type of a stitch, your pleat size is this big. So I did dots every ½ inch, so my pleat is actually an inch. So if you want a pleat that's only going to be ½ inch, you have to do every ¼ inch. So you're doing more dots for this method. The other way to do your gathering stitch or pleating stitch, or whatever you want to call it, is to just pick up a few threads at every dot. So after you've done your marking, you literally just pick up a few threads and gather it through. So this is what the front here looks like. The back, you can see I just have teeny tiny little stitches across all of them. When I use this particular thread to help gather, it's going to have a lot more material on the back of the fabric than it is going to in the front of the fabric. Because you're picking up at each dot, the pleats are going to be smaller, so you need to have less dots like you would for the even or balanced stitches. But it's easier to distort the fabric or not have it fold very well. So obviously both types do have their plus sides and their bad sides. There isn't a solid consensus on how pleating was done in the past historically, so both ways are quite likely, and probably both were used because of the simple fact that not everyone does everything exactly the same way every time. People have different ways of doing it. I tend to default to an uneven stitch just because for me it's quicker because I'm making fewer dots. Between them, I don't think it's a big difference otherwise. So when you've made several of these gathering stitches, I typically want to do at least 2 at a minimum. For the shirts where I had no embroidery or no smocking on top, I did at least 2 to put them into the necklines or into the sleeves or anything like that. If you're planning to do smocking on top of the embroidery, then you want to go down further so that you get to a depth that you plan to do your embroidery for. So for my sleeves here, I did a gathering stitch actually at each of these black dots here. So I had 4 gathering stitches for this one, 4 lines of them. Okay, so now that we have fabric with the stitches in it, you want to make sure that you don't actually anchor into the fabric. You're tying knots or something of that nature so that you can still pull the threads. If I pull, this is the even side, the whole thing just kind of starts accordioning and folding up. And I only went over to the middle of the fabric. So now we have kind of nicely folded and pleated material over here. You can see the back looks exactly the same. Obviously, that was pretty quick once we got the gathering stitches in. It didn't take very much effort or time. So all of the time in pleating is literally just making the marks and running the gathering stitches. Now for the other side, for the uneven, where I'm just picking up a little tiny dot, when I gather this, the pleats are smaller, so it is a little bit harder to gather. But if you look between the 2 sides, you can definitely see that this is much denser than over here because well, I can definitely see. I don't know if you can see it on the camera. Or from the back, maybe it's easier, I don't know. You've got a whole bunch of little pleats over here for the uneven, and then half as many on this side. So.
I'm sorry, can you pull that back a little bit? That was so close to the camera that it was getting kind of blurry.
Yeah. I was trying to just make sure you could actually see it, but so you have over here is the even and balanced version, and over here is the uneven version of the gathering threads. This is the back that I'm showing, so hopefully it's able to be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so once you have that done, you have a few options. You can either call this essentially done, and I'm just going to be pleating. I want to now put it into a band, and that's it. You can also choose to make it a lot fancier. Smocking is a type of embroidery that is done on top of pleating. It's not necessarily just one type of stitch. There are a bunch of different ways that you can do that embroidery, just like any other type of embroidery. Most often, smocking is done using a silk thread or a metal thread or linen thread. Silk is usually what I use, though I do have a project coming up that I'm going to be trying to do with metal thread for my smocking, so we'll see how that goes. But the main stitches that you can use for smocking are often an outline stitch, a cable stitch, a wave stitch, a honeycomb stitch, or pattern darning, like what I did here. I'm going to actually describe all of these, so it's not me just rambling off the stitches to you. There are others, obviously, but I'm just bringing up some of the, in my opinion, more useful stitches. So, an example of smocking that I happen to really love is a picture by Albert Dürer. This is a zoomed in picture of an angel, Melancholia. You can see that she has a very elaborately smocked and embroidered apron. This is most likely some sort of an outline stitch. It could also be a wave stitch. Not completely sure what they did for that particular pattern, but there are a few options. The shirt with the gold embroidery on the top has a very similar pattern to that one that I did. So for the actual description of the stitches that I am going to be talking about right now, I got them from a book that you can find fully online called Clothing for Women. If you saw the handout that I posted in the very beginning, it's listed in the reference section of the handout. Selection, Design, Construction, a Practical Manual for School and Home. It's a early 20th century book of how to make clothes for you and your family, pretty much. So while the book itself isn't in period, it does go over a lot of the embroidery techniques and things of that nature that are more in period. So first up is the outline stitch. It is very useful to do an outline stitch to get started for a few reasons. One, you have pleats that are unsecured to begin with. An outline stitch actually helps to secure those pleats to each other so that they're not going to come undone. So the way to do an outline stitch is you're going to be working from your non-dominant hand towards your dominant hand. So since I am right-handed, I'm going to be working from left to right. Normally you'd, okay, let's move over here so you can see me. Normally you'd want to actually anchor or tie off or something of that nature, which I am not going to do right now because I'm going to rip this out after and I don't want to have to deal with undoing the knot. But what you're going to do the whole time is keep your needle facing your non-dominant hand, and you want to make sure you keep the tail of your thread always on the same side. So in this case, I'm always going to have the tail of my thread down below my needle. So I'm going to pick up 2 pleats, and I would like to point out I'm using a tapestry needle right now because you don't want to split threads or anything of that nature. Okay, so I picked up 2. Now I'm going to move over 1 pleat and pick up the second of those 2 pleats that I sewed previously. So I'm literally just moving over 1 pleat at a time. And I'm trying to keep it in a relatively straight line. So what it ends up looking like is just a stem stitch across the top, if you know basic sewing terminology. And it just kind of helps keep all of the pleats together. One thing to note is that this is not a stretchy stitch. When you sew it, if it's something that you want to be able to spread out, you need to make sure that your pleats are spread. So if you are doing an apron or something of that nature, do your pleating and then make sure that your threads, your gathering stitches, are as wide as you want the apron to actually be at the end. Don't have it gathered as absolutely tightly as you can, because if you do a stitch like this at the top, you're not going to be able to spread it out very far afterwards. Okay, so that's an outline stitch. The next type of stitch that you can do is something called a cable stitch. A cable stitch is exactly like an outline stitch, except instead of always having your thread below your needle, you alternate your stitches so that sometimes the thread, every other, is below or the thread is above. So that ends up having kind of a more of an X pattern. There's also something called a double cable stitch that you can do, which is a single cable stitch with another single cable stitch below it, but instead of matching the stitches, if the stitch above in the cable had your thread below, the one below would have the thread above, so that it's a mirror image of each other. Not sure how well that's going to show on camera, but we will give it a try. So normally if I'm doing something like a cable stitch, because you're changing the direction of where your thread is hanging, I don't actually sew vertically, horizontally like this. A lot of the time I'll sew vertically so that I'm moving my thread left to right instead of up and down. That's just a personal preference, but if it works for you, cool. So same thing as before. I'm being lazy and not actually tying anything off. And I'm sorry with cameras that this is so hard to see, because in real life this would have been a lot easier to show. So, like I said, the stitch ends up being a bit thicker and kind of creates that cable look that you see in knitting and things of that nature. So this one, my tail is in the way. Like I said, kind of creates little tiny X's everywhere. I don't know how well you can see that. Same thing as with the outline stitch, it's not going to be overly stretchy. So another option is a wave stitch, which I happen to rather like. It's a zigzag pattern. Actually, here I have a picture. So this one's that outline stitch that I did first. This one is the cable. Over here is single cable. Over here is double cable. And this is the wave stitch. So you're literally just moving in a zigzag line. This is one of the stitches that the Apron on Melancholia, I think, could be. The other one would just be essentially this on a diagonal. So for this particular stitch, you are going to, once again, move over pleat by pleat, always keeping your needle in the same direction. Except when you move over to the next pleat, you're going to move up. Same thing, next pleat, move up. And when you have traveled the distance that you want, you can make another stitch, and you need to start going down. To start going down, your thread needs to be on the other side. So now I'm going to always have the thread on the top instead of on the bottom. For the uneven gathers, which side of the fabric am I doing the embroidery? I personally tend to do the embroidery on the side with less fabric. However, you don't have to. It's a matter of choice and opinion. If you do it on the side that is with less fabric, like what I'm doing right now, you have to make sure that you don't accidentally pick up your gathering thread with your needle when you're actually embroidering. But I tend to like doing it on that side just because everything's held together tighter and nicer. It's less floppy like the back, but you can do either side. Okay, and now I'm going to go back down. Okay, and you can see I'm starting to definitely get that zigzag look. I made my stitches a little too far over there so you can see the spacing a lot, but it starts to get a wave, and I really do like this particular aspect of it. I've used it a handful of times. Okay, so all the stitches that I've done so far have gone from left to right, or my non-dominant hand towards my dominant hand, and the entire time my needle was pointing towards my non-dominant hand. The stitch is largely determined by if the thread is above or below where you're working. The honeycomb stitch is rather different. So to begin with, it is a stretchy stitch. So it actually has some elasticity to it. The honeycomb looks like this, and it creates kind of a lattice work when you do it. To actually do the stitch, you're not going to be working in a straight line. You're going to be sewing in a zigzag pattern. So the pattern that you're stitching, once again, I'm sorry that I could not get my slideshow to actually work. You're going to be starting, I start on my dominant side and then I move left. So I personally think that's easier. You can continue going from your non-dominant side to your dominant side if you want, but I'll sew 2 pleats together, move through the fold at the back of the fabric, and sew 2 pleats together, sew 2 pleats together, sew 2 pleats together. I'm going to actually do this so you don't have to depend just on the handout diagram, but as a okay, so I'm not the only one who sews that way. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay, so we've got pleats. I'm gonna go on the back this time for the hell of it. This is the uneven one. I've just been working on the uneven side because I have more pleats. So to begin with, I'm just gathering 2 pleats. And then I'm going to secure those 2 pleats. I am a little OCD and I actually tie at every junction like this because it makes me happy. You don't have to, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't really take up much time. Okay, so now I have 2 pleats held together nice and close. I'm going to take my needle and I'm sewing that way. So I'm going to go down the pleat that is on that side with my needle. So literally it's behind the pleat in the crease, and then pop my needle out. Now from here, the next pleat over, if I pick that one up, I can sew it to that one particular pleat. So now I have two gatherings, one here and one here. And the thread travels behind in this fold. Now my next stitch is going to be up top again. Same thing as before. I'm going to travel behind and in the crease of this pleat and then attach it to the pleat that's next to it. So I went down and through. Now my stitch is hidden in the back. And I can tie these together. So as I go, it will, if you can see my sleeve, you can see how I travel underneath every single one. If you use really thin fabric with a very dark embroidery thread, you can see the thread through the fabric afterwards. So keep that in mind. I didn't think of that when I was doing this shirt, but I kind of like the striped look that it gives. So odd little things that you discover as you go along. So the entire time you're going to be moving in that zigzag pattern. And once you get to the end of that row that you're doing, you're going to move down and start with the second zigzag pattern. Let me grab something else very quickly. Okay, so the shirt that I showed earlier with the gold, the honeycombs here. Do I always start with the fabric pleated that tightly? For the honeycomb, no. How tight you start depends on a few things. First is going to be how much fabric you're using and how small of a space you're trying to get that fabric into. For this, it was a lot of fabric and I have a tiny wrist. So with all this pleating, I couldn't spread things out very far. The other thing that's going to make a big difference on how tight your pleats are going to be next to each other is how deep your pleats are. So for all of these, my pleats are 1/4 inch down and 1/4 inch up. So the entire pleat is a 1/2 inch of fabric. That's a fairly standard size for historical costuming, though a lot of people I know use larger pleat sizes than that. So if you're taking a lot of fabric with teeny tiny pleats and you're making it into a small area, your pleats are going to be very close together when you're embroidering. If you are taking fabric this wide and you're only pleating it down to here and you're using kind of big pleats, your pleats are not going to be very close together. When you actually do the honeycomb stitches, here we are, you're going to be pulling these two pleats next to each other every single time, and those are going to be pulled tight, but the ones up top are going to stretch out. So you can see that kind of created a little V there. I did the sewing really quickly and crappily, so it doesn't look that great, but so these will always be pulled tight and touch. These will always be pulled tight and touch. But when you spread it out, it will get that more honeycombed pattern, like you see there. So, does that answer your question? Do you want me to go into that anymore? Okay. So, honeycomb. It's a really useful stitch. Let's see if I can. If you actually have something for years and years and years and wash it and don't set it, sometimes the stitch unsets a little bit, but you can still see that that's a honeycomb in there. This one, apron. So like I mentioned, well, I don't know if I specifically mentioned that. I think I would have mentioned that later. For an apron, you usually want 2 to 3 times your desired width to start with. So you would have spread it out a little bit to do your embroidery, but this area actually still has some stretch there, unlike some of the other stitches. The last stitch that I really want to talk about for this particular section is pattern darning. Oh wow, it's later than I realized. I'm sorry, I'll go quickly. So pattern darning is what I have here. For this one, you're pretty much just weaving your thread through the pleats. Whenever you're on top of a pleat, your thread is going to show, and whenever you go through a pleat, it's not going to show, so it's going to end up being white. So you can get a lot of interesting patterns doing that. This one is a doubled version of that sleeve fragment that I showed earlier from the Museum of London. So it is an extant pattern. This one was done with metallic threads. Okay, so any questions on that stuff? My next section that I wanted to get into is mostly in the handout, but it's on aprons in case you want to actually use something really quickly. All right, so if you have questions, ask and I will stop. Otherwise, I'm just going to quickly go into aprons so that you guys can have a little bit more information there. So, aprons are really prevalent throughout a lot of Europe. It's a really common thing to find on both the lower class and the upper class. The higher class you get, the more elaborate your apron tends to be. Both men and women will often wear aprons. Men, it's often just a piece of fabric tucked into the belt. For women, it'll often have the ties and some sort of decoration. But one of my favorite things about aprons is that you normally think, oh, it's just this white, simple, plain thing that's not fancy at all. What am I going to do with that? You would be completely wrong. So a few examples, because I just love them. You have this one where the waistband is bright red, so you can add color. You have an actual yellow apron with all of the embroidery and smocking up on the top. So color and decoration. You have another apron over here, which is a very bright yellow. It almost looks like the bottom edge is curved, which is a really interesting shape, I think. And then my absolute favorite is I actually found an example of a woman with a pocket on her apron. And I don't know about all of you, but I absolutely adore pockets. I pretty much don't buy dresses anymore that don't have pockets. I sewed a pocket into the dress I'm wearing right now even. But next time I make an apron, I am totally putting a pocket on the front of it. So aprons do not have to be white. They do not have to be plain. They do not have to be simple. You can add color, you can add decoration, you can have accessories, and go all out. So if you actually do want to make an apron, how to do it is in my handout. There's also a section on how to attach the waistband, and that's if you want to do it by hand in the historical manner. That particular way of sewing is from a paper published on the Langberg Finds. It's a paper called How to Pleat a Shirt in the 15th Century. So it goes into all of the details there. Once again, I'm sorry that my slideshow didn't work, so I had to try to do this all verbally in front of you. But are there any questions that I can get to in the last couple of minutes? Okay, doesn't seem like. Yes, the Museum of London piece is pattern darning. It is a wool sleeve. I think part of it was silver. It was a wool sleeve, and then the tannish color was silk thread, and the inner portion, I believe, was metal thread. Oh, yes, the gathering threads do get removed when you're done. So if you're just doing something into a band, once you fully attach the band, you can then remove the gathering threads then. If it's something that you're doing more embroidery on, I like to have that there. And one example, actually, that I can pull up, if I can find it, there we go. The midwife apron, the German midwife apron, there's a lot of pleating here, and it's deeper. So to help secure the pleats and make sure they stay there, there's that outline stitch that we talked about earlier, but this is on the back to actually help secure everything. It's just like the stem stitch that you would do normally, just picking up pleats instead of threads. But that's a way to help secure the pleats, and then you don't see it. The Burgundian shirt, I think, is pattern darning. They say it's satin stitch, but everything that I've seen about it seems to imply pattern darning. And I've seen sewing diagrams of how to do the stitch. Yeah, it is probably a waste of thread. Have I ever seen fabric other than linen and wool pleated? I personally have not. However, I'm fairly certain you could easily do this on cotton. For silk, I see silk pleated in like outer dresses with large pleats, things like of this nature. But I haven't seen a ton of silk in the really, really dense pleating. Silk can be a more fragile fabric, so I don't know if that's why. I would love to see if they have any excellent examples of that. I haven't run across any, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Attaching the tie. So I assume you mean for on adding a waistband to an apron. I actually fully encase, so it's on the front and the back. Pretend this is a waistband, this is a shoulder strap, but it's on, this is the back, and this is the front. So the way you actually do it is to do a running stitch. You do a running stitch across holding the band on so that the band is below. Then you flip this up, crease, and do a whip stitch all the way across with holding and securing the pleats. Then you fold the band all the way around and back, and then whip stitch again so that you catch every pleat. So you're actually going the full length 3 times if you're doing it in the historical method. Obviously, you can do it on a machine if you don't care about doing it in a historical method. Yes, it is very similar to how you would bind the edges of a quilt. Okay, any final questions since it's a little bit after 8 now? All right, well, in that case, I hope you all enjoy your evening, and I am so glad that you could join us. Anyway, I am going to stay on to try and figure out my settings to actually get my slides to work for the future. So if you still have questions, I will be around. And if you come up with something later on, my handout does have my email, so please feel free to write me and I will do my best to respond quickly. So have a good night, all.
Thank you again. I will turn the recording off.